Hey, it's time for Uber Grace, and today it's going to be a little bit uberlicious. I wanted to look a little bit at what Jesus was actually kind of up to. At the time that Jesus came, there was a massive amount of pressure that was like a pressure cooker in Israel at that time. And this is relevant, so hang in there. Because all the way through Israel's history, they'd had a golden era when David was king and Solomon was king, and they'd had this amazing time of richness. No one ruled them, no one invaded them. They actually had a really great, prosperous time. And then it all kind of started to go pear-shaped, and eventually they got invaded by the local Arameans, and then they got invaded by the Assyrians, and then along came the Babylonians and took loads of them off into exile, into the city of Babylon, took all the top people. And then after that, the Persians invaded Babylon, and then it all became the Persian Empire, and the Israelites were still living in a foreign land. There's a few of them back in Jerusalem and around the place, but most of the top people were all, and the descendants of the top people were all in Babylon. So eventually the Persian king said, hey, send everyone back, and they rebuilt the temple. And then the Greeks, the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, went right across the Persian Empire and invaded the lot. So suddenly it becomes Greek. And when Alexander died, really young, in his early 30s, wasn't he? His 4 generals took over. This was all prophesied in Daniel, by the way, which is fascinating. But the 4 generals took over, and they actually split the empire into 4 bits. North Egypt was one, North Africa and Egypt was one bit, Syria and Iraq and all around there was the Seleucids. And one of the Seleucid kings was really cruel and harsh on the Israelites, so they bust free from them. And the group at that time popped out of the underground in the Jewish people, the Israeli people, and they were convinced, absolutely convinced, that if they follow the law to the letter, things will work out better for Israel. The reason all these mishappenings had befallen them was actually to do with their lack of obedience to the law of Moses. So they resurrected the law of Moses, codified it, and made sure everybody in their influence were obeying it to the letter. And then they got to a bit where the Maccabees came along, kicked the Greeks out, and they had like 100 years or so of freedom from all these empires. But then in order to keep that going, a chap called Herod kind of invited the Romans to sort of support him. And of course the Romans didn't really support you. They kind of came in and then invaded you. And so it got to a point when Jesus was in his early 30s. There had been a lot of Roman influence in Israel for about 100 years almost at this point, and the Jews were sick and felt they had a God-given right to not be in an empire. They felt they had a God-given right to not be under this. This was punishment for lack of obedience to the law. So they were training people and were scowling at everybody. They had to pray more. They had to read the law, their Bible, more. They had to study the prophets more. They had to live the most upright lives absolutely possible. And if they could do that, then maybe, just maybe, the Messiah would come, overthrow the Romans, and they would have their own kingdom back again. And if not, even better than that, their king, because he's God, would become king of the world. This is the pressure that was on every single Jewish person. It was incumbent upon every single one of them. They had to behave. They had to be uber spiritual. They had to be really well versed in everything and live the letter of the law to beyond what was reasonable. And of course, as you can imagine, the more and more that the Messiah didn't show up, the harder they had to pray. The more they had to read their Bibles, the more they had to live these holy lives, and it was never, ever enough. Never, ever enough. And that's why Jesus came in and riled against the Pharisees. He always gave them a good, hard time because they were putting incredible burdens on the people. Could you imagine living in that society? I mean, maybe it's a little bit like Afghanistan during the Taliban years, or maybe Saudi Arabia now, where you've got to completely live under all those social expectations of what the religious people are saying. It was even stronger on these people that Jesus was speaking with, because they were really crushing the spirits and the hearts of everybody, and it was never enough because the Messiah wasn't here yet. Right, we must try harder, we must try harder. And that is why Jesus always fell out with the Pharisees, often criticized the Pharisees, and that's why his message of freedom from all that they were piling on the people is actually really relevant today. Because if they can be free then out of that, how much more free can we be today in Christ? I hope that was helpful and interesting. Please share, like, comment, and I'll see you soon. Bye now.